Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm excited for and intimidated by today's conversation because these were some heavy chapters. And I don't know exactly where to begin, but one thing I wanted to say about this section is that as I was reading it, I started to have the feeling that everything about the book was coming together for me. So we had that experience in the last section that a lot of the plot lines came together into a single plot line, but thematically, it started to come together for me in this section. And I've been trying to formulate what that means in my mind, and discovered that I can only do so very clumsily and loosely. So I'd like to try at some point to present to you in what sense I see all those themes. At the beginning, I was talking about the different purposes I observed Hugo setting out to fulfill, like the tribute to the people of Guernsey, the tribute to progress, the love story, the Toilers, the toilers of the sea, and what it means to toil on the sea, all these different thematic elements, and they're starting to form into one in my brain. There was a big transition in this section too, because we had a lot of plot set up, then we had the rapid descent down the roller coaster, and then now I don't even know how to describe what we entered into now, something metaphysical. It's like we went down the roller coaster and then ended up in the stars somehow. I don't, but there was just so much that was abstract and philosophical and metaphysical in this section. And when I got to those, Lana and I were talking about our underlining habits, and that we got to a certain section in this book where she said she had to warn herself at the start, don't underline anything until you get to the end of the page, and then be selective about what you underline, because I think I have a good 4 pages where I underlined almost every line, which sort of defeats the purpose of underlining. So how should we start? I mean, we can proceed through what we experienced in order. I want to just open up things first, I think, to see if anybody has anything they're just very eager to talk about or start with.
Well, one thing interesting, you said it was very metaphysical, but one thing that struck me about this chapter was how also concrete it was. Like, it's the best execution I think I've seen of all the detail Hugo can bring, because it gave me such a real sense of what Juliet actually had to do. Like, all the complexity he was dealing with. Now, I couldn't recount all of it. It didn't like stick in my brain, but it was so, like, wave after wave of little problem he had to solve, all the little intricacies that I absolutely love. So it wasn't just, and you get, he connects it to the abstraction. So you get to, like, you'll get these lines that he'll throw out that summarize beautifully, abstractly what Juliet is doing or what it represents, but it's so completely anchored to what he has to do. So I just loved that. It was just, yeah, I liked relishing in that.
And really, all his concrete doing really revealed more about his character, or just he became more concrete. Like, who is he? And so that was kind of inspiring. Also, that he persevered through this terrible deprivation and hardship.
So that actually, so the first thing I'll introduce about the way I'm seeing this all fitting together actually relates to the point you're making, Joseph, that so this was, how do I introduce this? It's so difficult to talk about that I find myself tripping over my words, but so I'll put it this way. We came to a certain section, the section where it was describing the wreck of the ship in extravagant detail, all, with its guts hanging out. So when we get to see the Durand up close on the reef, and we can go back and I need to find where it is, but we could, the perfection of disaster, I guess, 244. So I'm reading along in that description, and it says, Among other things, the Durand had suffered the same kind of wound as a man cut in two. It was a torso torn open to release a mass of debris resembling entrails. Rope swung free, trembling, chains dangled, shivering. So it's this very, very detailed, descriptive, visual image. But then it starts saying, all around was evidence of tragic, pointless destruction. Everything was broken off, dismantled, cracked, eaten away, disjointed, cast adrift, annihilated. And as I was reading those lines, I thought to myself in that moment, this sounds like the embodiment of chaos. Like he's describing the wreck of the ship, but it sounds like he's capturing chaos in the natural forces of the world in general. And then I felt a little silly for thinking that, like, I'm just reading the description. And then the next line was, everywhere was dismemberment, dislocation, disruption, and the kind of disorder and fluidity that is characteristic of all states of confusion, from the melees of men that are called battles to the melees of the elements that are called chaos. I'm like, okay, I feel validated. And then he goes on to elaborate on that theme at great length. So the Ananke of things that he set out in the beginning, this is the Ananke of things, chaos in the natural forces of the world that man has to conquer and has to try to conquer and also has to make sense of, which was the fascinating thing. That was a new element that I feel like that was brought into this chapter, is the trying to conquer it physically and trying to make sense of it spiritually. So the connection to Gilliatt in particular in the development of his characters, there's this interesting notion that the toilers of the sea, these intrepid sailors from Guernsey, are in a unique position of having to face and, in a sense, grapple with these forces of chaos. And so I feel like he was sort of telling us that we might on the surface perceive them as simple because they're not intellectual, but there's a depth in a different sense because of the confrontations that they have to have with these monumental forces. Yes.
Yeah, that's a great passage. But if you look a little earlier on higher up on 245, much of the damage looked as if it had been done on purpose. Yeah. Anyone observing would be tempted to think, what deliberate wickedness. Now, that's really interesting, because when you think about something bad happening, I don't know, like I had flooding in my basement last week. That was not fun, but I don't think that the storm had anything against me. If, on the other hand, I found out that a human being had come to my house and poured water and wanted to ruin everything, that'd be wickedness, and it would be different. Now, what's interesting here is that part of what happened to the Durand was the fault of a person, and part of it, of course, is nature, but Gilliatt doesn't know that. Okay, yeah. Comes into the situation without knowing that. And I think that's interesting, because we readers, we know that there is some wickedness involved, but it's as if it looks as if it could be wickedness, even if you don't know that it's wickedness. And that's that's awful, because it's not good that there are storms, but the idea that somehow bad nature has it in for you, that you don't belong in the world, that the world hates you, it's hard to live with that. I mean, if you actually believe that the world is against you as opposed to being in favor or neutral. And so I think that's part of what's going with the picture of a man being cut in half. That would happen by design, by a person doing it. So I think when we talk about chaos, I think that's very good, because you can think of chaos as both what the world is like without order, or you can think of it as chaos come again, going backwards, rewinding and so on. And I think that's what makes it metaphysical, the idea that, well, the world could go backwards. So
Well, that
And
so that was what
yeah.
was so fascinating is that it seems to have transitioned into him really truly battling the forces of nature. You know, it was Cluban who set this in motion by deliberately wrecking the ship. But now the situation is such that it's the forces of nature that he has to battle. And they do feel malevolent and deliberately malicious. And then, I mean, one of the lines that absolutely took my breath away, I mean, literally, I just like gasped when I read it, was on page 270 and 271, after it's described so much of what he's had to do. And then if you look at the end of section 10 on 271, what a terrifying thought it is to contemplate this perpetual recommencement, this bottomless well of the ocean. These, pronounce it for me, somebody. Danaids, the clouds, all this labor for nothing. No, not for nothing, but only you, the unknown, know why. Whew. But for him, it feels like he's battling deliberately malicious forces. And then Hugo ruminates on this a lot and contemplates on this a lot and doesn't attribute to Gilliatt the direct contemplation of these issues, but just he feels all of this. He just doesn't think about it.
It's remarkably, in that spirit, it's like Moby Dick. And I wonder, in the Moby Dick, the narrator says, you know, when you don't leave the land unless you're ready to face this aspect of nature. So we have so much that's comfortable and regular because we've tamed it. We've tamed the natural world on land.
Oh yeah.
But then when you go out into the sea all by yourself, like Gilliatt is, actually there's a character in Moby Dick that gets a boy who gets thrown off into the ocean and abandoned, and they pick him up. He was able to, but they pick him up a day later, and he's gone insane because he's alone in the whole thing that Hugo was describing. So I think that it's much easier to feel that these things are malevolent and that you are in the maw of a monster when you're in this situation than we deal with in our normal lives.
Yeah, there was the line.
Well, this is just such a. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Just quickly, because it relates directly to his point. On 252, it says, in Europe, where nature seems to feel constrained by civilization, such events are rare, so rare as to be presumed impossible. So we've protected ourselves so well in civilization against the forces of nature that we don't end up having to confront these issues, and we almost disbelieve that they exist. I'm sorry, Greta.
Yeah, well, it's funny because Lana and I went swimming in the ocean yesterday, and we got out there. It looked pretty calm when we got out there, and there was like a rogue set, which is just where the waves get really big, and it just kind of like, and we got out, and it was for the next 30 minutes that we were watching the water. It didn't happen again, but it is just like with the ocean specifically, like it all changes so fast, and you do feel so at the mercy of the ocean. But I was thinking also that earthquakes are like that because that just happened too. Like that's one where nature doesn't care that civilization has tried to tame it.
And the Moby Dick, which I haven't read, but just as you've described it and from what I've heard, that also connects to that whole section about the dark and the confrontation with the dark. I'm trying to remember which chapter that was. But that, you know, where the eye is limited, the mind can go farther, but then just grappling with the unknown, basically, was that whole section on the dark. And there's feeling that sense of vulnerability and the unknown. You can see why someone alone at sea would feel those acutely.
Just since you said alone, that's one of the aspects of this section that we read that's so unusual and powerful, right? Because we've got one person all by himself, and with only us to keep him company. And the rest of the book, there's been the question of relationships among people and kindness, dishonesty, whatever. But here he's all by himself. And well,
yeah,
maybe that's why it's so powerful and involving, because there are no distractions. It's just him and what he has to do and trouble. And what Joseph was saying before about all the different steps, I think there might almost be too many things for us to keep track of. I mean, one of the times when I was reading this, I tried making a list and I couldn't really, Juliet's to-do list, and I couldn't do it. And I think that might even be deliberate on Hugo's part, that it's impossible. And if we can't even read it, then how could a human being actually do it? There's a sense of wonder there.
Yeah.
And then again, he wrote it, so I guess someone could keep track of it. But yeah, he's miraculous enough by himself.
Well, I laughed out loud when I got to the line on 287 that says, "This is, of course, a much abridged account of Gilliatt's work, omitting many details that would make the matter clear to other professionals, but obscure to everyone else." It's like, oh, now you're saying
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I think that happened long ago.
I think Brian had his hand up before.
Yeah.
Brian, if you have.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I just wondered, like, how do people think that Julia really thought the accepted, like a malevolent universe premise, or was this more of a, like, I could speak for myself, like, based on the buildup of his character and how he's acting under less extreme conditions, I sort of interpreted it as, this is just the way he felt as time went on, and he was exposed to harsher and harsher conditions and didn't have enough to eat or drink or, sleep or anything, then maybe he would move toward really thinking, the world has it out, it is against him. But I didn't really think he's that kind of person. Like, he was still functioning on a very rational level, despite all the harsh conditions.
Yeah, but I think he's not reflective, right? He's he lives in a reverie. So I think that's, and I also, sorry. So one thing, I just don't think he didn't articulate this stuff to himself the way that Hugo was doing it. Another thing is, I couldn't tell, it seemed to me in a lot of these passages, at least it was called the metaphysical ones, I wasn't sure that we were seeing it from Gilliatt's perspective. No. But it was more like, this is universal man.
Yeah.
And then you kind of get little glimpses. He'll go back to Gilliatt, but I guess I didn't feel like that was Gilliatt's experience so much as it's we're watching Gilliatt, and then we're also looking at this, and it's more our reflections than it is Gilliatt's. That's
definitely how I saw it. I mean, I wrote in my notes that it's an adventure story set in a poem on chaos. Like, feels like the backdrop of what Hugo is saying about this situation that Gilliatt confronts, but it's not how Gilliatt himself is reflecting on it. And also, when we were trying to capture what kind of character Gilliatt is, it seems, you keep mentioning the reverie. It seems like he's capturing a type of character that the way I was trying to say it before is, we think of them as simple, but that's misguided to think of them as simple. But he's not intellectually sophisticated, so he's not going to articulate these things to himself. But there's a certain kind of spiritual grandeur that he has because of the life he's living and the things he's facing. So I loved, there was that passage, I have to find it, but there was a passage about something that an explorer almost has to be ignorant.
Yes.
Takes ignorance, the intrepidity of ignorance, to be an explorer. But then he goes on to say, but that's not to say that there isn't power in the intellect, to be an inventor. We still, inventors and scientists require the intellect, but it's just two separate things that they're accomplishing. But I liked to see that as, don't dismiss these laborers of the sea as lesser in stature somehow. In certain ways, they're grander in stature than these people in civilization, more in civilized life that we're talking about. It's just a different kind of grandeur. And this confrontation with the elements is part of what makes him grand. So that's where I saw the Guernsey people, the toilers of the sea, the confrontation with the elements, like all of that kind of coming together for me.
So a question.
I'm just the passage about the discoverer and the inventor, that's over on 285 to 6. That's where it is. And and everything that you were just saying about Gilliatt's greatness without being articulate, that's here too. Did he understand it? No. Did he feel it? Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, Hugo is the one who expresses it, and that's 297 is where that darkness stuff starts.
Okay.
Yeah, and then it kind of keeps going to 299, where you've got our language, Hugo's language, versus Gilliatt doesn't understand it but feels it. So basically everything you're saying is it's the way that the book is working on us. Anyway, I'm sorry.
At the start of that section that you were talking about, there's on 285, this captures it perfectly. There's nothing equal to the timidity of ignorance unless it be its temerity. When ignorance becomes bold, it has within it a compass, an intuition of what is true and right that is sometimes clearer in a simple mind than in a complicated one. So there are ways in which he's superior to us because of his direct connection with these forces, but it's not a contemplative, reflective, intellectual capacity. It's some kind of internal compass or intuition that he has because of this direct connection with
and so
formidable forces.
It might be important in this regard that Gilliatt is not civilized in a way. He grew up completely on the edge of, and interacting with, but not a part of society. I also wondered then what extent we're getting Hugo's picture of a pre-civilization imagination.
Well, it reinforced to me my feeling that there was something else about those lizards. Remember when the lizards came to accept his company, and Luke said it showed how long he had been there, which is true, but I had the feeling, no, but there's something more here. And now we see him similarly accepted by the birds on top of the great Douvre rock. And I think it's connected to this element that we're talking about, that he's outside of civilization in a way that we're brought to admire in a certain way, not outside of the civilization in the Rousseau sense, I think, but just having to be solitary and deal with nature directly, and it makes him at home among the animals.
So one question I had is, I found between the first readings we did and the second, kind of a bit of a shock in Gilliatt's character that maybe I just misread the first part or the second part, but he seemed more intellectual to me in the first part. Hugo talked about him reading lots of books, and I think at least, and he just seemed like such a complete hero to me. And then in the second part we read after he falls in love with, oh man, what's her name? Irshette. He seems much more simple. Burst this bubble for me almost. Not burst it, but it felt like a complete shift in character. So I'm wondering what I missed. And now I kind of felt like we returned to that first character that I got to know in my first reading. So I'm wondering maybe what I misinterpreted in the middle.
I'm pretty sure there was one line about him reading.
Yeah.
I think you might have
projected
invested too much into that one line. But I didn't perceive him as an intellectual character. I perceived him as really being differentiated from the people around him.
Not intellectual, but like not a simpleton. I didn't get like he was a simple-minded person.
You remember where it talks about what he read?
67. 67.
Thank you.
I just remember him feeling like just a really well-rounded person that
well, I want to challenge the idea that he's not a well-rounded person now, because he's a distinct person. To me, this integrates with the point I was making before about that's what Hugo doesn't want you to do, is dismiss him because he's not intellectual. He wants you to appreciate this is a unique kind of great man, but it is a specific type of great man. And the type he is one who's dealing directly with the formidable forces of the universe, like battling the formidable forces of the universe, and that gives him a certain kind of spiritual depth that's different from the one who's like sitting back in Guernsey, participating in the daily life of society.
Yeah, I guess the part that, because I didn't feel like he I had great admiration for him in the first part. I guess it was more his response to Déruchette and how simple that looked. Like it felt at first when I read it, maybe still now on reflection, a little out of character from what I had read in the first part. Because he seemed to be this dissociated person.
Yeah.
And so that's maybe what I'm trying to reconcile is this person that seemed one way in the first part didn't seem like he'd be able to have that sort of reaction to Déruchette that he did. Like,
but he has
if you look back at that passage, it doesn't ever say that he read the books, except this is all in the context of all the outsiders look at him and what they suspect of him, I think anyway.
Okay.
And it said that the Reverend Harrod saw the books and read the titles, and then the last one he mentions is De Rubarbo, and it says, yeah, but Jillian couldn't have read that because it was in Latin.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's not clear
but he's
he
also
actually read those books as much as that he had them in his library.
But that title makes him suspect too, and then it turns out it's only about rhubarb or something.
Yeah, like that Candide, right, was on there. You think a guy who read Candide and would have some there'd be something left in him from that, but I just wonder if he even read them, if it was just the books he inherited.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I guess I feel more like he is kind of an intellectual, that from the first part, and that's what I was trying to express before. I think, he's in this extreme situation, and that colors what's happening. But he's able to handle so many different contingencies. He has to have more than just practical experience to be able to do that. That's the way I feel.
Well, I think from Hugo's, there are two ways we could look at that. What we think somebody in that position must have to be able to handle it, or what Hugo is saying about it. I like to just try to focus on the second of those. And Hugo, there's this thing about the internal compass. He does seem to think that there is, we're saying intellectual versus not intellectual, but I think that means like book learning and participation in kind of the standards of society and what it means to be an intellectual. Obviously, both he and lay theory have to be brilliant in certain respects and educated in certain respects to do what they do, but it's just not, he's not going to be able to have a conversation about Candide. He's not reflective about the big questions of life and things like that. But I don't think we're meant to think of him as simple-minded in the sense of a fool, simple-minded in the sense of not not doesn't really understand society, simple-minded in the sense of outside of society.
That makes a little more sense, because I don't think of him any lesser. Like I think he's still great. And
It's almost like the life they live, because Lay Theory was simple-minded about love too. It's like the life they live means they never learn what it means, like what love means and things like that. But they have a primitive, they have a primitive sense of love that makes Gilliatt able to have this like fixed idea as he goes out to battle the forces of nature. He's doing it all on her behalf. So there's this primitive core, powerful compass of love, but not the notion that you should actually talk to a woman if you love her and try to make conversation with her. The ways that society, in society we've developed dealing with these things, he's totally ignorant of all of those.
Yeah, and maybe a good way for me to frame it is, I didn't think of him as an intellectual from part one, but I still felt he had a sophisticated soul. And the encounter or his reaction to Déruchette felt contrary to that. But when you put it in the framework of he's outside of civilization, that orients me a bit more, because that reaction seems so bizarre and not sophisticated, but it's not sophisticated in the context of certain norms that he is outside of. So I think that helps me reconcile it. And it's still, it doesn't challenge his greatness in any way to me.
Yeah, so things like on 297, when we're facing darkness. Darkness is invisible. It is inhabited by the absolute, which takes up no space, and inhabited also by things that do not take up space. I think that Gilliatt would have, like, that would mean nothing to him. To hear those words or read this part in Hugo would mean absolutely nothing to him, even though he might experience all of that, but he didn't conceptualize it.
Yeah.
The way that Hugo is.
Well, it's funny because at the very beginning, in our very first discussion, I said I love Gilliatt, that was my reaction to the first. But what I realized recently, especially in all the descriptions of the things he has to overcome and the heroic actions he takes, well, anyone who read 93 with me knows I was in love with Radub. Like that was a character I had a crush on. I don't have a crush on Gilliatt. It's a totally different character, and that simple part of him is what makes him seem not like a stature, a figure of romantic stature, just like he's not a figure of kind of intellectual reflective stature in that way. But I still love him. There's still something that I really love about this and admire about this character, but it's fun to differentiate him in those respects.
I really want to bring up the culminating point of can I do that, or do you?
Let's go for it.
He didn't just conquer it, he tamed it.
Mm-hmm.
That was magnificent. And you've kind of all the terrors of everything that you've experienced in this reading to come up and then shut the gate, have the foresight to have the gate, and then to make that terrible place work for him. So he's got the force of gravity and the force of the sea, and it's tamed now. That was magnificent. So it made me think, in kind of connecting with these other things we've been talking about, that Gilliatt is the one who is the kind of person who made civilization possible. He's before civilization in some ways, but because he encountered the natural world in its terrors, but also in a way where he could intuit it. He wasn't removed the way that civilization removes us from nature. He was intimate with it. He could tame it, and in taming those forces, that makes civilization possible.
That's really interesting, because there's this recurring thing in the book about these kind of primitive technologies being primitive. We can look back on them as primitive, but they were, on the other hand, they were the thing that made the later technologies possible. Hugo makes that point several times in the book. So seeing Gilliatt as at the starting point of that development, the type of person who harnesses these things directly, and then from that we develop more and more technology. We've got a little friend here.
You're gonna say something, Terry? You're muted.
Oh, Guinevere. I don't know why her
Sorry?
thing says says Terry, but that's Guinevere. You're muted if you wanted to say something.
Okay, is that better? Can you hear me? Okay, I thought I could hit the space bar. I was just listening to Heather's comment about what would Déruchette think if she saw me doing nothing. And I remember really liking that, because he always is doing something. You know, he has to be doing something, and then he feels like, I have nothing to do now. Maybe she won't love me? I don't know. It just seemed like a very interesting thing for him to think after doing all of that stuff. And he needs the rest. I mean, he's been working so hard. What's wrong with doing nothing? But he can't handle that idea.
Well, I had a question about that too, is that I just couldn't tell. Like, I don't get what makes it worth it for him. Like, is it still just all about Déruchette?
I felt that was it was a wake-up call in some ways. Through the whole reading, we're just focusing on Gilliatt and what he's doing and what he's facing and immersing ourselves in it, but we're kind of clueless, and he doesn't even that throughout this, Gilliatt never forgets Déruchette. That's kind of the impression I got. Like when he brought that up very abruptly, it's like we weren't even aware or remembering that all of this, I don't know, it's almost though he didn't get so much into the I'm the man taking on the nature and doing all this stuff. It's Déruchette.
One thing that
strong.
This whole section reminded me of, so there were a couple of times where Hugo said something along the lines of no person had any business of being here. You know, no one would have any reason to see what he was doing. And there's this quote, I think it's by Edmund Hillary or something, on why go climb Everest. And he says something along the lines of like, if you can't understand that there's something within man that needs to, like, you're not going to discover anything by doing it. Maybe you'll learn a little bit about oxygen at high altitudes, but if you can't understand that there's something that within man that compels him to face these challenges, then you don't understand what it is. I'm paraphrasing badly, but that's kind of the impression I got from this, is like, no one has any business doing this. And it's not that Gilliatt's conscious of this. It's just, he's got Déruchette, like he wants Déruchette, and now it's maybe a compulsion. I don't know if I'm projecting.
Yeah,
but
I think he wants. Sorry.
Go ahead, Heather.
Well, I just think he has set her up in his mind as this idol almost, and he wants to earn her. You know what I mean? Like the way that he thinks she is, he wants that person to think that he's that great and to have that stand. You know what I mean? Like it's a funny thing that he's doing, because that's not who Déruchette really is. But he's got this image of Déruchette, and that's whose respect or that's whose love he's trying to earn. But it's not the real Déruchette.
It is interesting because the Hillary quote, we can't imagine attributing that to Gilliatt. And I think that's what Andrew was saying, is that we don't hear any of that from him, like a satisfaction in the sheer conquering or the like adventure of it. It's almost like that's just a fact. That's just a given now that he's going to do all
but
that.
Don't you get like the line with the eyes where he has pride in what he's accomplished?
Let's look at those lines.
Yeah, can you find that? Because I'm looking at the 307 where it talks about the job was done. Gilliatt gazed at the scene as if stunned. The poor fellow was not overcome by joy. He was bowed down by an immense happiness.
Yeah, I love that line.
He had performed a miracle. And he looked on the result with astonishment. I'm not quite sure how to take that. What does it mean? It wasn't joy, it was happiness.
I've experienced that, and it's such like there's something when you do something that you've been struggling, like I've been in tasks before where I'm so in the weeds on something and I'm just fighting a problem so much, and then finally you do it and you just the sense of you're not conscious. It's not even like I achieved this great thing. It's like this thing is great and it's in front of me and it's done now. And I know that line really resonated with me. Again, sometimes I have trouble figuring out what I'm projecting onto this versus what's actually there. So I'll use you guys to help me.
But if that's the way to feel about it, then I would think that if he was driven by wanting to achieve the thing, then he would have felt kind of triumphant joy at having done it.
But that's why I'm saying I don't think it's a conscious, like, driven to achieve the thing. I think it's Déruchette pushed him towards it, right? Okay, I'm going to do this thing. And I think there's a nature within him that, faced with it, because we don't hear any narrative throughout this part about him longing for Déruchette or that being the motive force. It's just there is this thing in front of him, and it's not like I'm going to conquer nature even. It's just a compulsion to do it.
So let me just, can I suggest a substitute word for compulsion? The way I would think of it is this is sheer embodiment of will, that this is the forces of nature against human will. And if you read those passages that you're talking about, which I like, that's where I underlined every single one and put like 100 hearts in the margin there. That's all of that, it's perseverance, it's will.
Which page?
This is page 292 to 293. The second rate do not allow themselves to be put off by the second rate allow themselves to be put off by apparent obstacles. The strong do not. For them, the prospect of perishing is merely a possibility. The prospect of conquering is a certitude. I'm trying to find that. I saw the word will and person. Okay. At the end of that, about the eyes, a man who loves exerts his will, and a man who exerts his will radiates light and brilliance. Resolution puts fire in the glance, a noble fire that results from the combustion of timid thoughts. Wow, that's a great line. And I didn't underline that one. A noble fire that results from the combustion of timid thoughts. Sublime characters are stubborn. It feels like the Déruchette thing set this in motion. He set himself this task, and then there is no thought about it after that. It's just sheer exertion of will against the forces of chaos.
Yeah. So on 294, I think that really helps too. The second last paragraph. He saw the progress he was making in his work and saw nothing else. He was hallucinated by his objective, which he was within reach of achieving. His work was going to his head. The human will is intoxicating. A man's soul can make him drunk. Drunkenness of this kind is known as heroism. That really fits with what you're saying.
Yeah, and I would never that's why I like that Edmund Hillary quote. I couldn't imagine him saying it, but he's the embodiment of what Hillary was trying to say, what Hugo is acting as the describer in this case.
Mm-hmm.
As I was reading this, I wanted to compare it with the Lord of the Rings on Mount Doom, Frodo and Sam, the final, the ultimate chapter and end of this quest. The will, Tolkien uses will over and over again. I think it'd be a really interesting comparison to see what's going on there with this, but that's pretty neat.
Okay, more motivation to read it. So I wanted Heather also to go back to what you said about an idol. I mean, it's almost like it is an abstracted idol now that that's what he's done this for. And then it just becomes about sheer conquering. He's just focused on the conquering and not even the satisfaction of conquering, just I'm going to conquer. But there was the line about him looking for I forget what they call it, but the figure of the woman on the
The doll, yes.
The doll on the
It's David
Duran,
Shed, right?
The
which
figurehead.
it was of Deruchet.
Oh, I missed that.
Oh my gosh, because the line back when it introduced the doll, it said it was like a terrible, clumsy rendition of her, but Lethieri loved it so much. So it said he would give his 2 arms for that doll if he didn't need them so much.
Yes.
Oh. All right, let me look back at, this is just a side note, but in that first description of the Douvres Reef, which we could spend endless time, the image of the Titanic dolmen and all, just the amazing description of that. I was in Greta's apartment when I was reading that, and at one point I said, oh, and also I have an image of that, which I'll share in the chat. So I said to Greta, I'm sure it's not accidental that it looks like an H. Hugo loves to do that. And then on the very next page, it said explicitly that it was in the shape of an H. The huge capital H formed by the 2 Douvres, linked by the crossbar of the Durand, stood out against the horizon in a kind of crepuscular majesty. So Hugo loves to put images of H's in his work, doesn't he, Shoshana?
Yeah, and there's something like 93 also has that architecture.
Yes. Oh, 93 does?
Yeah.
Oh, in the Torg?
Yeah. I think I've seen a picture of it.
Uh-huh.
That,
yeah. I just hadn't made that connection before, but I'm sure it's true. When I can't recall whether I mentioned that when I toured Houteville House, one of the fun games that people play there is to look for all the H's that he's put in the architecture of the house, some of which are subtle, some of which are not so subtle, like the one I'm posting in the chat.
Yeah.
Right now.
Disneyland and the hidden Mickeys, right?
Yeah. But he put H's everywhere in that house. Let's see.
I will say this conversation has helped me explicitly identify all the things I love about Juliet. And just that reading. There is things I that were on the tip of my brain. And now I like it even more.
Oh, good. Yeah, I was uncomfortable with the idea of being disappointed in him, so I'm glad we've come around to liking him even more. I mean, I've got so many. Does anybody have any favorite passages that they want to share? Well, one, I'm curious how a criticism of Hugo was suggested to me that his writing is repetitive. And I wonder if people feel that way when they're reading it, because I could see that argument, but the passages that I think would be pointed to as repetitive are some of the passages that I think of as distinctly Hugo in style and make me feel reminded that I'm in Hugo's world and very happy to be there. And I think of them as rhapsodies on a theme. You know, we've got that in music where you'll take a theme and rhapsodize on it and have just variations of expression of the same theme. And I think that's something that Hugo very often does, is take an idea and then play with it and give you all sorts of different formulations and ideas about it. And then often what he likes to do is distill it down to the shortest formulation he can come up with at the end. And so I've always been fond of that as a stylistic element of his, but I wonder, there's a lot of it in this section. I wonder how other people reacted to it.
Well, I had a conversation with a friend yesterday about this book, and he has only read 93 and found it very difficult. And he asked me how this book compared with 93 and, if he should read it. And then I was thinking about that and I thought, I'm glad that this isn't the first Hugo book that I've read. I feel like I've been well trained to appreciate this book by you. But I like that whole section that we just read, like one thing happened and it hasn't even happened yet. We don't even know if he got back with the engines in that whole section, right? And that's the way that Hugo is. And is it repetitive? Yeah, I think I like the way of putting it that you put it, which the rhapsodizing, which is like he's circling around this one idea and really sort of trying to nail it down. But I think he does do that more in this book than in others that I've read.
But it is true that you have to have patience for that. I mean, you have to be invested in that and say, okay, this is what kind of a book this is. If you're looking for, I mean, I think of 93 as having as requiring that of you the least. That's why I teach it to my 8th graders, because there is such fast moving plot, even though it has some of those elements. So yeah, that's interesting. Molly?
Yeah, I had to stop about halfway through this assignment because I just felt so full, like I couldn't take in anymore. After the cave scene, I just I didn't know he got out of the cave. I thought he was going to be stuck in there or there would be more drama. And then it ends in the next sentence. And I should have just read one more sentence knowing that he got out there safe. That would have really made me feel so much better. But that was so suspenseful and so drawn out, and there was so much variation to take in that I couldn't go on reading. It was like too much to process in one sitting. So I had to take a few days.
It's really
off.
interesting because I told you I read it almost in one sitting in Guernsey, but I think I'm very good at forgiving myself for letting a lot go. I honestly think that's what happened in the first reading, is that I was just like, oh, I'll get the gist of it, but I won't try to understand in detail what's happening inside this cave, and I won't try to grasp all the nuances of what he's saying about the confrontation with chaos. I'll get the general idea of it, and then reading it this time, it's felt heavier. It actually felt more challenging, I think, because I was, well, first of all, I'm going to come in and talk to you. So I was more demanding of myself as a reader. So I can totally relate to that feeling reading it.
Well, I want to ask about that really quickly, because the analogy I've been thinking about is my experience with the Impressionists this year for the first time. And like, when I was just so taken aback by it, I didn't expect to like it, but when I just let myself look at it, the feeling that washed over me it stimulated my imagination in this really interesting way. And that's kind of what I've found, this like happy medium with Hugo, where I don't try and, especially on some of the denser parts, I let it almost wash over me. And I wonder if that's an appropriate way to read him, and B, whether maybe some of what he's doing is intentional, right? And Shoshana got me thinking about that when she said there's too much detail in this section for anyone to actually absorb it. Maybe he's being intentional sometimes, where he's being repetitive or hammering an idea home just so you really get the feeling, even if you don't analyze it line by line.
I feel like if that was the intention, then the ideas themselves would be more vague. Like an Impressionist painting, it is vague. There are no details to zoom in on, but Hugo's, it's not like that. Like every line is so clear and saying something definite. So I don't know.
Well, maybe he's addressing it. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Johnny, you had something to say?
Donna?
Yes, I feel maybe a little conflicted about the writing, but I was thinking the way we were reading Les Miserables, this would be great if you just did little pieces at a time. But sure, there was a long passage about all the things that he were doing, and I find that heavy. But at the same time, he's such a poet. Like that's why I like when even though if he elaborates and there's more or rhapsodizes or whatever, I just savoring it is something that I really like to do more with reading Hugo with you, Lisa. So thank you for that.
I mean, it does make his books well worth rereading. In my curriculum, I've been teaching the same books for 20 years almost now, and I never get tired of them. So there's something new to discover every time, and it's always fresh sharing it with a new group too. But yeah, it is. I mean, Hugo was a poet almost primarily. Shoshana wasn't he?
Yeah.
Thought of more as a poet than a novelist in France.
Well, they admired his poetry, and
Yeah.
The novels were subject to criticism, and the plays got banned, but everyone loved the poetry. So part of that is that we don't have the carping criticism, and also he wrote so much poetry that you can hardly keep up with it. I mean, I have not read all his poetry.
Mm-hmm.
So, but
you can see
I'm sure
the soul of the poet.
Yeah. Who was it? Maybe it was Gide, who's the greatest writer in French literature, and he said Victor Hugo, hélas, meaning that everyone acknowledges alas, right? Everyone acknowledges that he's the greatest, but they have criticisms of Hugo the man or Hugo the novelist and so on, but that everybody knows he's the greatest poet, taught the language how to sing. And I guess I've always loved the novels more, but maybe I need to spend more time with the poetry and memorize them. That's the way you come to love poetry, is when you appreciate how every word has to be what it is. I think you're right in saying that it's the poet in him that leads to some of the, well, I'll tell it again, because poetry is based a lot of it on repetition. A rhyme is a repetition. It's biblical parallelism. I say it once, I flip it around. Yeah, it's and the writing is gorgeous.
Well, that's the other thing that I can't speak to because I don't read it in the original French, but I just had the experience, which I'm very eager to share with you soon. I finally finished my translation of Rostand's poem Un soir à Hernani. And Lana is now making it beautiful in print for me. But I was working with my friend Antoine on the translation the entire time. And so part of what I wanted to do is have a recording of the original French and a recording of me reading my translation. So Antoine, who has a beautiful reading voice, has recorded the entirety of the poem for me. And listening to him read the poem gave me profound anxiety about and disappointment in my translation. Because when I hear him read it, it is sublime. I mean, the feel, the sound, it's just exquisite. And the meaning too is exquisite. But I've tried to make it as mellifluous as I can and as pleasing to the ear as I can, but it's still clunky in comparison to the flow of the original French all in rhyme. I didn't even dare try to make mine in rhyme. So the same has to be true of these passages in Hugo, that we've lost. The meaning itself stands up so well to translation, but we have to have lost so much in the sheer sound of the language.
Yeah, well, it's I mean, I've got my French here, but I have not been, I'm slower with French, so I've been checking, but I haven't been reading the whole thing. But when you actually are reading it and you slow down the way you would for poetry, it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
Even the dialogue, where he has people who are not Hugo talking. And so how is it that they're speaking so fluently? But they're speaking beautifully also. Yeah. almost, well, you know, well, you love Radub from 93. He speaks very well.
Uh-huh.
Right. He speaks probably better than the actual person would have spoken.
Sure. Yes. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I should go and read at least the French, read those passages in French, because I love his lines. I know them in English by heart. Speaking of 93 and Toilers of the Sea, I'll just call out a line that I really loved here. This is on page 241. It says, Gilliatt was wearing his seagoing clothes. A woolen shirt, woolen stockings, hobnailed shoes, knitted pea jacket, trousers of rough coarse material with pockets, and one of the red woolen caps then worn by sailors, known last century as galley caps. He recognized the Douvre reef and steered toward it. That was such a simple line, but it had just been established that this is a place where no human being ought to go. And then he sees it and steers toward it. And it reminded me of the line in 93 with Simorden, where he's told by the innkeeper repeatedly, now go right. That's the safe way to go. If you go left, you're going straight into the heart of battle. Don't do that unless it involves, what you value most, like a son. And then it just says he turned left. It's a very simple phrasing. So I like the understated power of that line. Well, are we left with any questions or topics?
Well, I'll read a line that I like.
Okay.
You asked earlier. It's on 293 for the people on this one. It says, perseverance is to courage what the wheel is to the lever. It is a perpetual renewal of the fulcrum. Whether the objective be on earth or in heaven, the only thing that matters is to make for that objective. The former case is for Columbus, the latter for Jesus. The cross is mad, hence its glory. To achieve suffering and triumph, it is necessary to leave no room for argument with one's conscience, and to allow no relaxation of one's will. In the sphere of morality, a fall does not exclude the possibility of soaring. A fall is the starting point of a rise. The second rate allow themselves to be put off by apparent obstacles, the strong do not. For them, the prospect of perishing is merely a possibility. The prospect of conquering is a certitude. You can offer Stephen all sorts of good reasons for not allowing himself to be stoned. Disdain for reasonable objections engenders the sublime victory in defeat that is called martyrdom. I just like that one.
I just looked in the French for that, steered toward it, and it's avancant, advanced. Just
even more abrupt.
Yeah. That's where he's going.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, I didn't mean to undercut what we just heard, which was very good, but I had a feeling that Hugo had said it even better.
Mm-hmm.
Can I say, I just want to say, I really, can you hear me? I can't tell.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I really like his imagery, and the imagery is so powerful in Hugo that I find myself really uncomfortable reading this book, because I do not like the ocean. I do not like being in the ocean. I don't like boats. I don't like being on boats. I don't like any of that. And so reading all this is very uncomfortable for me, because he has such a skill at making you feel like you are in that position. You are Gilliatt. You're there. You can see what he sees. You can feel what he feels. And it's so uncomfortable for me, but it's great writing. But it's hard.
And now you're not only on the ocean, you're in a charnel house,
right,
in the middle of the ocean.
Right.
Alone. The imagery of that section was.
And the power of the words when he's describing the storm and what happens with the ship and going on, and you just imagine being on the ship when it got pushed into the Douvres, and just it's hard for me to read, because it's just, I really don't like the ocean or anything, so it's very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else expecting Clubin to show up somewhere, like in a cave? Or I was expecting him somewhere the whole way through, like maybe he'll be hiding in the hull. Or
I think he got eaten by that octopus that I'm pretty sure Gilliatt found. The octopus, I think it was an octopus that he saw that creature that was that in the cave when he was in the cave?
Well,
and
I'm
there was
hoping he was
some
eaten.
creature. I think it was an octopus, and I'm pretty sure that we're supposed to think that that's what got Cluban.
Well, I imagine we're not just going to be left to think about what happened to him.
Yeah.
Very good writing.
I was worried about him showing up somehow somewhere the whole time.
Yeah, we don't know what that thing in the cave was, right?
No.
Interesting.
That was my best guess, was an octopus.
But so I know Hugo loves to juxtapose the beautiful and the grotesque. And he just seems to delight in doing that. But I think that was part of the power of all these descriptions, is there's simultaneously something so exquisitely beautiful about some of these places, and yet they were totally terrifying at the same time. Just that cavern, I remember there being a description of like sparkling like emeralds. So you could, but at the same time lurking with death dealing creatures. Here's another brief line that I really loved. Nothing withstands the determination of an ant. That was on 265, and that was the culmination of one of those lengthy descriptions of all the incredible labor that he had to go through. This was, let's see, what was he doing here? I was just like collecting all that was of value that he could find from the wreck. But it's just, again, that steady persistence of will makes him formidable, even though each individual task that he's doing is in some ways trivial in the scope of things.
I wondered what people made of the Subumbra chapter, starting on 294, where I was able to enter into his descriptions of the sea and chaos and the cave and everything. I had a harder time experiencing the night sky as he's presenting it here. I don't know what stands out to people in this chapter.
Well, one thing that stood out for me connects with what we've been saying about the character of Gilliatt and the sense in which he's both simple and sublime all at once. So on page 296, at the top, it says, the inaccessible added to the inexplicable, that is the sky. The contemplation gives rise to a sublime phenomenon, the enlargement of the soul by wonder. Sacred awe is peculiar to man. Animals have no such fears. The human mind finds in this august terror its eclipse and its proof. Can anyone explain the last part of that to me? The human mind finds in this august terror its eclipse and its proof. But just the idea of these kind of things that are so inaccessible to man, filling him with a sense of sacred awe. That is something that.
Oh, yeah. I was just that I had that line underlined too, and I thought that it was saying that its eclipse is like realizing how small it is and how insignificant you are as a man, but also that you're something different from just an animal. So it's proving that you're something more than just animal, but also something so small and insignificant.
So you're feeling a sense of sacred wonder because there is something so much greater than you. But the fact that you have the capacity to feel that wonder is proof of what you. Okay, yeah, thank you.
It's the human mind, particularly.
Well, I think grammatically, though, what's being eclipsed is the sacred awe.
No, the human mind finds in this. Oh, I see. Finds in this
I think
August terror.
it's referring
Okay, yeah.
back to the previous sentence.
Right.
That
But
being
that's still
eclipsed,
the.
what's being proved is that there is something sacred. And and the fact that you're terrified makes you both doubt that there is anything sacred, that there is a God, because I'm so terrified right now. Why would God do this? Or there can't be a God because I'm terrified. But then it's also proof that there is something sacred, some power, because it created this, or it
Gave you the capacity to have that feeling, or okay,
or no, just that look at the sky. I mean, look at the Milky Way. There must be something great there. So it's both terrifying to contemplate, but also how did it get there this way? How could something so great be there? So it's both a proof and a denial at the same time. It's a nice contradiction.
Yeah.
I definitely read it the same way that Lana did, because I don't think grammatically that it has to be referring to the sacred awe.
No, but in the
right?
it's the
I think
August.
it might.
It's the August terror.
But the August terror, doesn't that refer back to the sacred awe?
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, I think I'm beginning to agree with you.
Well, the human mind finds in this sacred awe its eclipse and its proof.
No,
right. Does it find the eclipse of the sacred awe or the eclipse of the mind?
The human mind finds in this August terror the eclipse and proof of the sacred awe is what I'm claiming.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be. Grammatically, it doesn't have to be that way. It
Maybe
could be the way that
that
Lana is reading it, and I think that.
Yeah, well, if the human mind finds its eclipse and its proof, where does it find it? In this August terror. Yeah. So it's.
If you diagram that sentence, only the human mind finds in this August terror its eclipse. Its is what? Its is the mind.
They're in the same paragraph. I'm not saying it can't be
grammatical element. These two sentences are one grammatical element. So if you diagram the two sentences together,
can you do that?
Clear, but
they're not one grammatical element, but it doesn't. I mean, I'm not denying that they're in the same paragraph, but it's just that the way that you're reading it is not the only way to read it. So you do have to bring in greater context. And I think in the greater context, I don't think the rest of this paragraph is saying the darkness makes man doubt whether there is something greater than him or not. But
there is a lot of that, because if we go a couple of paragraphs down, it says the frictions of the mechanism are what we call evil. In this darkness, we sense evil, a latent denial of the divine order, an implicit blasphemy by things hostile to the ideal. Evil is present in everything as a protest against things as they are. It is a hurricane that harries a ship at sea. It is chaos, which hinders the emergence of a world. Good has unity. Evil has ubiquity. Evil upsets the pattern of life, which is a logical system. But I had the sense, I mean, I really struggled with this section too, but I had the sense that all of these things that are outside our powers of comprehension and that are terrifying to us give us the sense that they're a denial of divine order. And that's earlier when I was talking about just like grappling with chaos. Yeah.
But again, not the denial of the existence of divine order, because if it were just a denial of the existence of order at all, then the chaos wouldn't be a problem, right? So I thought on the next page too, I thought this, I don't know, maybe this doesn't help, but I was wondering if it did. The short paragraph, it says, he knows nothing of the detail, but he bears within him in quantity proportion. 297.
Okay.
Just the facing one. Says
Okay.
he knows nothing of the detail, but he bears within him, in quantity proportionate to his mind, the monstrous weight of the whole. This obsession led the shepherds of Chaldea to discover astronomy. The pores of creation secrete involuntary revelations. There's a kind of automatic exudation of knowledge that is conveyed to the ignorant. Every solitary, exposed to this mysterious impregnation, becomes a natural philosopher unawares. But I thought, because I guess my worry with the other way of reading it is that he's talking about this absolute and this whole, and that kind of coming to terms with that. But I don't think there's any doubt that there is some sort of absolute.
No,
And
no, he has
I guess
no.
I worry. Yeah, but
Uh-huh.
I thought the other reading of that sentence would make it sound like that, right?
I interpreted Molly as saying it's the eclipse and the proof, in the sense that that it's proof that there is something great, like there is an order to things ultimately.
Yeah, that was how I took it. Was
Yeah.
that there he ends with proof, so he's ending on the side of, but it must be true.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
So you're
an
saying he's
eclipse.
just saying there
It's an eclipse.
the human.
It may make you doubt, but then it's also the proof.
So you're saying the human mind finds in this august terror the eclipse and proof of the sacred awe peculiar to man, or of what?
Yeah. That
That sacred awe is
both
justified.
why we have a sacred awe, why we might doubt what it might wipe out some of our sacred awe, but also prove that it should happen, that we should have that sacred awe.
Okay, so the sacred awe and the terror are different.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because you find in the terror you feel the disproof but ultimately proof of the awe you feel.
Yeah.
And that would be different or the same as the contemplation. Because basically I read this whole part, he's kind of talking about different things, but I thought it was all referring to the same phenomena, right? He says, this contemplation gives rise to a sublime phenomena, the enlargement of the soul by wonder, sacred awe, and then he says, this august terror. And I thought all of those are kind of trying to refer to the same feeling. So he's saying that within that feeling, there are different parts of which one is proof of the other. Maybe it's just not that important, but sorry.
I was going to ask, does the French lend anything to this discussion?
Good
Is this a
question.
problem of
Not really, because the it's is just the possessive pronoun, which is governed by the word that comes after it. Now, as I'm looking at it, it is a little tricky because he's trying to say something that's hard to say. He says that these universes which are nothing exist. Now, that's a contradiction, you know, which are nothing. But he then says that there's a difference between being nothing and not being. Now, in normal English, we wouldn't say that. And in normal thinking, we wouldn't say that, you know, being nothing and not being, but being nothing is itself a kind of contradiction, which is what he's getting into next. The sacred awe belongs to the human, and the animal does not know this fear. And the intelligence, which I think does, as Hogarth says, mean human intelligence, finds in this, that has to mean that we're referring to what we were just talking about. You know, this great terror, an eclipse and a proof, which again sounds like a contradiction, because an eclipse means something that covers it up and a proof means something that affirms it, and he's trying to say both. So it doesn't really help, because what he's trying, I think what he seems to be trying to do is to express something that's he's stating a contradiction. Something that is nothing exists. How can something?
I don't know if this helps at all, and it's too bad we lost Andrew just now. But I sort of he had to go to another meeting. My experience of reading this chapter, which is the one he was asking about, was starting at the level of man, and then slowly backing away to a broader perspective. So at the level of the human being, we have these doubts and terrors and this capacity for sacred awe. And there's something we don't understand, and there's something that frightens us, but at the same time, that capacity and the nature of the thing that our capacity and the nature of the thing that frightens us is also proof that there is something greater. So then throughout the course of the chapter, I felt like I was being given almost this God's eye view of the universe, where ultimately what we could see on page 299 is the whole incessant and enormous movement is performed without hitch and without interruption. Man participates in this movement, and the degree of oscillation he suffers is known to him as destiny. Where does destiny begin? Where does nature end? What difference is there between an event and a season, between a sorrow and a fall of rain, between a virtue and a star? And then he goes on and he says, we see ourselves caught up in this mechanism. We are an integral part of a whole that is unknown to us. We feel the unknown that is within us, fraternizing mysteriously with an unknown that is outside of us. And I just felt like I was backing away to look at this complex interlocking mechanism of which we're a part, and that there is a sense to the whole of it. But when we're inside of it, we're just seeing the forces that we confront and not capable of or not in any given moment able to see how it connects to the whole. And only, I mean, there are many times throughout this that he refers to the unknown, or to the eyes in the sky, or to something that can see how this all fits together. But that's not the experience that we have in those moments of confronting what seems so inexplicable to us.
And I think right near what you were reading, he talks about anguish and delight.
Mm-hmm.
And ordinarily, anguish and delight wouldn't go together.
Mm-hmm.
So it's as if he's gesturing for something that
Mm-hmm.
he can't quite describe. But I think that where we started with this was that it's a quality of human consciousness. He says that that we've got this horrible, wonderful problem, which the animals don't have. I think that's what he's trying to say, that it's a great thing for consciousness to have this, and yet it's also something that seems to obliterate consciousness if you can't quite catch hold of it.
Yeah.
It's, well, Ayn Rand doesn't write this way. You know, I mean, if she were trying to write about something, she would be very clear about what we know and what we don't know. And with Hugo, part of what he seems to be trying to do is to, I don't know, recapitulate this experience of different things at the same time. I think.
Well, and also in his worldview, that we don't know is part of the nature of things. Like, I mean, that there's a sense in which we don't know, but he would say it's also confrontation with what we don't know. He is saying should fill us with a sense of awe and wonder, and ultimately, I think, give us confidence that there is a great order to things. In the end, there is an order that we don't know, but the unknown should fill us with wonder, as opposed to, you know, cutting off the unknown, something it is difficult. All right, well, anybody have any last thoughts or questions?
I'll just clarify something about, well, I'll let you finish them, and I want to clarify.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Course. No, it's about the astronomy course.
Oh, okay. Well, is there anything we want to say to wrap this section up? I mean, obviously, the big question we have is he going to rescue? Is he going to find Cluban? And is he going to rescue the engines? Is he going to carry this through? And then what will happen if he does with Déruchette?
I will say I found it so painful to have to stop reading
Good.
yesterday. So I'm very excited for this
And
discussion to be over so I can continue.
the next section is 315 to 372. So we end with De Rochette.
Ooh.
So I have a feeling you're going to be unhappy about stopping there too.
So I'll clarify something about the astronomy course. So registration's officially open. I'm looking for more people that want to participate live. There's a lot of people that want to watch the recordings, but I want to try and get a few more people in the live discussion. So it's not going to conflict with the reading group. I just want to make sure we clarify. This group ends on the 30th, and then Lisa's moving to the Sunday time slot. So there won't be a conflict between weekly readings and the astronomy course. I'm just going to take over this one while Lisa does the other group with Sue Lloyd on Sundays. And there's no homework and no reading assignments, so there's no preparation needed either. So it's only if you can make an hour and a half available every Saturday, then I think it'll be well worth your while.
So if I can just quickly make a pitch for what's up next in discussions too. So yes, Sue Lloyd has agreed to join us for probably around 4 sessions to discuss La Princesse Lointaine, which is the one she said after Cyrano de Bergerac we ought all to read by Rostand. So I'm intrigued to learn why she thinks that. And I found a translation online that I can share with everybody. And you can get it in print if you want, but I'll have a digital copy that I can share with everyone. And so that would be the next, but she's only available to meet on Sundays. So that one will be on Sundays. I don't know what it will be after that, but then Alan Kors has agreed to join us to do, he has 2 books that he'd like to cover. I told him we'll start with one and then I'll do my best to persuade him to do the other one also. What he would like to discuss is Voltaire's Candide, which he regards as misunderstood. I've never read it, so I don't know what the understanding of it, but I'm eager to learn the understanding and the misunderstanding. And he also wants to do Darkness at Noon, Arthur Kessler. Which is another of his favorites. And he says he taught it in seminars for decades. So has lots to say about it, but he is just a wonderful human being. If you have the opportunity to interact with him at all, I strongly recommend that you do not give up that opportunity. So that there's a lot of wonderful things ahead.
Yeah,
Yes.
Molly.
The time for Sundays, do you know when that will be?
I will share that, but I think she said, I can probably look very quickly. She said 4 p.m. Minehead time. So that would be 8 a.m. for us.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so probably in early October 7th, we'll start the astronomy course on Saturdays at 8 a.m. And then I'm sure Lisa will send out the exact date that the other book will start with Sue Lloyd, but that will be Sundays. So no conflict. If you're interested in either one, feel free to email us. We can send you more details. The astronomy course, definitely reach out if you think you want to be an active participant in that.
Great.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you. See you next week.
Thank you. Bye.